Ancient human instinct has one dark answer to famine: eat each other to survive. The line every culture calls unforgivable. But why does this keep happening across thousands of years and completely separate civilizations? And is there actually physical proof? 5 documented cases, from a 14-year-old girl's skull in colonial Jamestown to a 2,500-year-old Chinese text about families swapping children, trace one escalating pattern from individual desperation to state-engineered famine. In 2012, archaeologists at James Fort in Jamestown, Virginia, found a skull fragment buried in the dirt layer dating to the winter of 1609 to 1610. The colonists called it the starving time, and roughly 80% of the settlement died during those months. Historians had long suspected cannibalism was part of what happened, but they never had physical proof, not until this skull surfaced in the excavation. Douglas Owsley, the head of physical anthropology at the Smithsonian, analyzed the remains and identified the individual as a girl of about 14. The teen called her Jane, and her skull told a story no document could. 4 shallow chops marked the forehead, a failed first attempt to break through the bone. Then deeper, forceful chops from a small hatchet struck the back of the head until the cranium split open. Knife cuts and punctures cover the jaw, where someone worked to remove tissue from the face and throat. But here's what the record actually shows in those marks. Owsley described them as showing tentativeness, trial, and a complete lack of experience in butchering. The person doing this had never done anything like it before. That hesitation is exactly what separates survival cannibalism from ritual cannibalism in the archaeological record. Ritual cut marks are practiced, systematic, and deliberate. These weren't any of those things. The intent was clear: to remove the brain and flesh for consumption. But the hands doing the work were unsteady. Think about that for a second. The person was so desperate that they crossed the ultimate taboo, but they were so inexperienced they couldn't even do it cleanly. Therefore, the hesitation itself is the evidence. This wasn't a ceremony or a cultural practice. It was desperation recorded in bone, and it confirmed what historians had argued about for 4 centuries, but could never prove. One skull, one moment. But does this pattern repeat? Or does it end here? If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe now. The next 4 cases only get darker. The next case is one most people think they already know. In 1846, a group of 87 pioneers heading for California were trapped by early snowfall in the Sierra Nevada, near a lake that would later bear the name of the family at the front of the wagon train. The Donner Party spent nearly 4 months snowed in before the first rescue party arrived. By the end, 48 had survived and 39 had died. The popular version is simple and grotesque. They were snowed in, they ate each other. The end. But the documented reality is more complicated and more human. Survivors went to extraordinary lengths to avoid cannibalism first, boiling animal hides into a glue-like paste, eating charred bones, twigs, leaves, and bark. They ate their pet dogs. The Alder Creek excavation in 2003 turned up more than 16,000 bone fragments from rodents, rabbits, deer, horses, oxen, and dogs, but no clear human remains at that site. The primary evidence comes from the survivors themselves. Patrick Breen kept a diary through the worst of it, and one entry records a neighbor saying she would start eating one of the dead. Breen wrote that it was distressing. A journalist named Charles McGlashan corresponded with survivors over 40 years and documented many recollections that cannibalism did occur, mainly eating the bodies of those who had already died of starvation or cold. In one case, 2 Miwok guides were murdered and eaten. Some Donner descendants still refuse to believe it happened. Therefore, what the diaries actually show is ordinary people who exhausted every other option first, then crossed a line every human culture draws, as absolute, not monsters, just desperation with a paper trail. The evidence is in their own handwriting, not in rumor or legend. Two isolated cases. But one ancient text proves this wasn't rare. It was routine. The Zuo Zhuan is an ancient Chinese narrative history composed in the 4th century BC, covering the period from 7202 to 468 BC. It's one of the most important texts in the Chinese tradition, and it has produced more Chinese idioms than any other classical work. In the passage covering the 15th year of Duke Xuan, the Zuo Zhuan describes the siege of Song in 594 BC. The state of Chu besieged the city for 5 months, and the food supply was completely exhausted. The text records what happened next in 6 characters that became a permanent Chinese idiom. The people of Song resorted to trading children for food and burning bones for fuel. Families exchanged children with each other so that no one had to eat their own. Nobody really talks about what that means in practice. 2 households would trade their children, and each would eat the other's child, because eating your own was a boundary that even starving people couldn't cross. The phrase is yi zi shi, and it entered the Chinese language as the expression for the logic of desperation under siege. The Zuo Zhuan gives the moment a face. A man named Hua Yuan was sent on a secret night mission into the Chu camp, climbed into the bed of the Chu General Zifan, woke him, and told him the truth about what was happening inside the walls. The city had resorted to swapping children for food and splitting bones for firewood. The same account appears in the Shiji, the records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian, the foundational text of Chinese historiography. But this isn't a single anomalous passage. The same phrase, exchanging children to eat, appears in other ancient Chinese sieges. The siege of Jinyang in 403 BC, where inhabitants exchanged children to eat as floodwaters rose to within 3 planks of the city walls. The siege of Handan in 257 BC, where the people were burning bones for fuel and trading children for food. Among all major civilizations, China has the most recorded instances of cannibalism, and it experienced more famines than any other. Therefore, Song's families built a system out of desperation, trading children so the bond between parent and child stayed intact even while everything else collapsed. That is what makes it more unsettling than any single act of desperation. The cruelty was organized, deliberate, and recorded as fact in the foundational texts of an entire civilization. This wasn't modern, but the 20th century would prove it with police files. The siege of Leningrad lasted 872 days, from September 1941 to January 1944. Nazi Germany blockaded the city to starve it into submission, and over 1 million people died of hunger. At the peak, mortality reached 100,000 people per month. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, kept records on cannibalism throughout the siege, but those records weren't published until 2004. Before that, most evidence was anecdotal. By December 1942, the NKVD had arrested 2,105 people for cannibalism. They divided them into 2 legal categories: corpse eating, eating those who were already dead, and person eating, murdering someone for food. Person eaters were usually shot, and corpse eaters were sent to prison. The historian Anna Reid notes that for most people at the time, cannibalism was a matter of second-hand horror stories rather than direct personal experience. But the Soviet criminal code had no law against cannibalism. The legal system had never imagined this would be common enough to need its own statute. every conviction was carried out under Article 593, a provision for special category banditry. Of the 300 people arrested in April 1942, only 44 were murderers. The rest had eaten the dead. 64% were women, 44% were unemployed, and 90% had only basic education or were illiterate. Only 2% had any criminal record. Most were unsupported women with dependent children and no history of crime. Therefore, the people behind these numbers were ordinary and desperate, not criminal, mostly mothers trying to keep their children alive. Given the scale of starvation, it was relatively rare. Far more common was murder for ration cards, with 1,216 such murders in the first 6 months of 1942 alone. An enemy army caused this siege. The next famine had no enemy, just a government. The Holodomor was a man-made famine in Soviet Ukraine from 1932 to 1933. It killed an estimated 3.5 to 5 million people, caused by Soviet collectivization policies and grain requisition quotas under Joseph Stalin. The word Holodomor means death by hunger in Ukrainian, and the famine wasn't a natural disaster. It resulted from political decisions made deliberately, with full knowledge of the consequences. At least 2,505 people were sentenced for cannibalism in Ukraine during those 2 years, according to the historian Timothy Snyder, and the actual number of cases was certainly much higher. Ukraine's Interior Ministry published 1,202 criminal case files on cannibalism in 2023. Most cases were necrophagy, the consumption of those who had already died of starvation. But the murder of children for food was also documented. One woman, asked why she had killed and eaten her own children, told police that her children wouldn't survive anyway. But this way she would. A woman doctor wrote to a friend in June 1933 that she hadn't yet become a cannibal, but wasn't sure she wouldn't be, one by the time her letter arrived. The secret police in Kyiv province collected 10 or more reports of cannibalism every day in March 1933 and concluded the real number was much higher. A black market in human flesh arose, and the Italian consul in Kharkiv reported that the trade of human meat was becoming more active. But the Soviet government knew what was happening. Reports documenting cannibalism were sent to Moscow and shelved. The chief of the secret police warned that written notes on the subject shouldn't circulate among officials where they might cause rumors. Public discussion of the famine was banned entirely, and it stayed banned until the late 1980s. The information was collected and it was ignored. Therefore, the Holodomor is the case where cannibalism stops being an individual response to starvation and becomes a result of political policy. The famine was man-made. The state knew what it was causing, and it chose to suppress the evidence rather than stop the policy. That is the difference between Leningrad and the Holodomor. One was imposed by an enemy, and the other was imposed by your own state. The breakpoint of hunger isn't a line that separates us from them. It runs through every human society, and the only variable is how close famine has pushed people to it. If this made you think differently about what humans are capable of, subscribe for more stories the history books leave out. And if this pulled you in, the next video's already queued up. Click it.